Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the 9th generation of the Pokemon series and the 4th main game on the Nintendo Switch. Released in 2022, it was the long-awaited next generation after Sword and Shield in 2019, which is the first new generation on the Switch, and was coming off the back of the massive success of Pokemon Legends Arceus, the game that shook the entire foundation of how Pokemon games are traditionally played. Sword and Shield had a big change to the traditional Pokemon format because it introduced a new concept to the franchise, which was an open world environment. While there were still some traditional routes, 2 massive wild areas were added that made Pokemon spawn in an overworld style, meaning you could see them while walking around, as first seen in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, as well as still being able to encounter them randomly in the grass. This would become the staple in the 2 games that followed, and is almost guaranteed to continue in future games, especially after the transition into fully 3D worlds. Some claim Legends Arceus to be the perfect format to play a Pokemon game, as you have seamless transitions from battling and catching, multiple massive areas to explore, and maybe most importantly, everything packed into one game. There was no divide between buying 2 separate games, or having to coordinate with players online to trade and complete Pokédexes. I would agree that this is massively better in terms of overall convenience and enjoyability when playing. Needless to say, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet had some pretty big shoes to fill and needed to show up in a big way, because all eyes were on the next game that Pokemon was going to drop. Unfortunately, as we all know, Generation 9 had a rough start from the jump. The biggest issue that plagued the game was the performance. Scarlet and Violet have since then made somewhat of a decent comeback, but it sucked to see such a long anticipated game suffer so poorly at launch. It's far too common to see game releases fall into that same boat of basically half-baked games just to meet a deadline, but that's a conversation for a different video. Scarlet and Violet have gained a wide variety of opinions, ranging from the worst game in the series to the most fun players have had from a Pokemon game in a long time. Regardless of your and my opinion of the game, I'm here to say it's okay to like, and even love Generation 9 Scarlet and Violet. Let's start by addressing the cons of the game. The biggest one, as we know, is the performance. The game was glitchy, stuttery, and the resolution isn't great. Especially at launch, the Switch seemed to have a really hard time running the game. Running around the open world, you see textures half loaded, and the other half had this shaky feel to it. Everywhere you go, you see water and cliffs that are so awkwardly shaped, with basic geometry with no real flavor added to their designs. And at a distance, things are at their worst. Now, playing the game today, the game runs a lot smoother, but there was never any major post-launch updates for graphics or anything like that. Generation 9 was definitely a step back in overall visual quality and performance from Sword and Shield and Legends Arceus. For a lot of players, this was an absolute deal breaker for them, deeming it the worst game in the series. In terms of visual and performance, it's sad to see such a half-baked product out of Nintendo, especially when it's their 4th major Pokemon title on the Switch. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, while they look stunning and I love the art style very much, they weren't open world like the other 3 games, so it's harder to make that comparison. However, I would make the claim that even Pokemon Legends Arceus wasn't that stunning in terms of visuals. While it played well and looked good, the world still lacked that sort of polish to make them really stand out. Pokemon in the distance, especially when flying, turn to 1 FPS until you get reasonably closer. With the releases of Scarlet and Violet's DLC, I think both additional zones look and play much better than the main Paldean area, and while it's still not necessarily the benchmark of a Switch game, let alone of what a Pokemon game should be, playing the game today still shows a huge upgrade in playability from the launch. The next con I want to address is the open world, which has a couple different parts to it. Even though the game is open world, you're still confined by level constraints until you progress farther into the stories. For example, the starting few areas like Los Platos hold Pokemon around your level, but traveling north to Glaciado Mountain yields Pokemon much higher. This is normal like in most open world games, but it would have been so much nicer to see level scaling throughout the whole world, having all Pokemon around the same level as you progress. While there's still a very large variety of Pokemon you can find throughout the game that are suited to your appropriate level, those team building options would be practically endless if you could access all or most areas whenever you choose. In my opinion, Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl did this very well in the Grand Underground. While you were still limited to Pokemon depending on how far you progressed in the game, the Pokemon in the Underground were always around your team's level whenever you visited, and then more Pokemon would become available as you obtain more badges. The lack of level scaling also ties into Scarlet and Violet's multiple stories. The 3 story paths in the game are your standard gym battle to the Elite Four, Team Star, and Titan Pokemon. Now the player has full reign to choose how they want to play the stories, if they want to play one individually all the way through before starting the next, or cycling between them to get a little bit of everything. While the latter choice is definitely the recommended way to go, and probably how most people played it, your option to choose is heavily limited. All parts of each story are available to the player across the map at any time, however each part has fixed levels. The short of it is the player is forced to play in a specific order due to level constraints. For example, Giacomo of Team Star has level 20 Pokemon, and Eri has level 50 Pokemon no matter which order you fight them in. This was a big complaint from a lot of players because the open world isn't as open, as there's no level scaling as you progress through the stories. In my opinion, tying level progression in with the story and wild Pokemon would have made Scarlet and Violet a way better experience in terms of giving the players more different ways to play. I also feel like because there might have been such a huge focus on the open world component of the game, the towns throughout were really lacking. In so many previous games, cities seem to be bursting with life, conversation with every NPC, and maybe the most important thing is to be able to go in every building. From towns like Fort Tree City, walking across rope bridges in between houses, to Lumoy City where it's so big you can actually get lost and take a taxi to your next destination. The towns in Scarlet and Violet were okay, but most importantly they lacked personality. You can't really even talk to most NPCs in the game, they just have a short blurb pop up overhead. Moreover, besides gym battles, nothing major happens in these towns throughout. Towns have no lasting memory as you move to the next one, seldomly ever revisiting them. To be fair, Mesagoza is the main and biggest city with a very big purpose in the game, and overall I liked it a lot. I just wish other cities got more love in their designs. The Kitakami DLC did a great job in my opinion, in only having one main center, with a couple smaller sites near it to serve a big purpose of the story, then making the rest of the surrounding areas for exploration. Likewise with Blueberry Academy, the entire terranium was solely for Pokemon and exploration, and it wasn't trying to have too many things in one. My other complaints with the game were pretty minor, and honestly negligible in the grand scheme overall, like feeling like it was too easy, and not all Pokemon being in the game. Everyone is going to have their own complaints with the game, but these were the biggest ones I've experienced, as well as heard from the Pokemon community. Okay, time for the pros. Let's start with the story. The game is jam-packed full of memorable characters that actually mean a lot to the story, and contribute in their own way throughout its entirety. Arvin's story is one of discovery and sadness, with his mother or father depending on which game you play, and the deep exploration of Area Zero. Penny's story is about overcoming personal insecurities and fixing your wrongdoings. At first I wasn't a fan of Team Star, but as the story progressed I found myself more engaged. And let's not forget your rival Nimona. She's there with you every step of your journey, pushing you to new heights and always hungry for another battle, unlike other rivals in previous games where they just show up and then disappear again for half the game. On top of all that, the box mascots have never played a bigger part in the story. Scarlet and Violet is the best story we've seen from a Pokemon game in a very long time. In my opinion, the biggest highlight of the story and the entire Paldean region was Area Zero. The regular map size is already pretty large, but you get to explore the giant hole in the middle of the map, which is about half the size of the area around it. So it's pretty big. Tons of more Pokemon can be found in different levels, including some brand new Pokemon to the series, which are none other than the Paradox Pokemon. These are based off existing Pokemon in the game, like Fluttermane looking like Mischievous. But depending on which game you choose, these Pokemon were either future or past based, my personal favorite being Ironthorns. While Area Zero was such a cool additional place to explore, it was even cooler how it was integrated to the story and tied everything together. As we all know, the gimmick of Generation 9 is none other than the terrestrialization. With this, you can change the typing of one of your Pokemon for the duration of the battle, or until that Pokemon faints. To be honest, at first I wasn't really a fan. I didn't see the point in changing the type if I could easily just blow through everything in my path. But we often dislike the things we don't fully understand. So the parts where I did get stuck in the game, I put my thinking cap on and put the Terra gimmick to work. I will say that Terra Pokemon is the gimmick that requires the most thinking and strategy. Unlike a Mega Evolution or a Z move, I think there's a lot more value out of a perfectly planned terrestrialization. In the story, it doesn't really pose much of a threat. Really, the furthest extent you see is an Electric Terra Mismagius with the Levitate ability. But in the competitive scene, that door is drop-kicked wide open with a world of possibilities. With over 600 Pokemon in Generation 9, the ways to build your team how you like are almost endless. Speaking of competitive, online play has never been easier in Scarlet and Violet. Items needed to tailor your Pokemon perfectly for battle against others are basically limitless, and thanks to the Pokeportal, competitive play has never been bigger or better. Along with competitive, raid battles are the other major component of online features. Raid battles were introduced into the franchise in Sword and Shield. The concept of fighting one giant Pokemon alongside your allies hasn't changed, but now it's more enjoyable in Scarlet and Violet. The 4 faint limits have been replaced with a raid timer, and the rewards for completing them are so much better in my opinion. Options for seamless drop-in, drop-out invitations with friends or randoms makes raids easier to complete and overall just more fun. Tandeming your stat-perfect mons with a strategy of terrestrialization makes for some very satisfying victories when defeating those 6 and 7 star raids. Almost 3 years after release, new raid events are still being added to the game, challenging players and rewarding them with rare Pokemon like legendaries or with the Mighty Mark. After exploring everything the main stories and area has to offer, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet had the addition of 2 DLCs. The Teal Mask and Indigo Disc DLCs were a fun experience post-game and a great way to log many more hours. I like how the story from Teal Mask continued in with Indigo Disc and finally tied in with Area Zero at the end. Having played this and Generation 8's DLC, it's hard to say which is better because they both have their respective pros and cons. Teal Mask, while short and a limited zone, is a fun little area to explore and has an addition of brand new Pokemon to the decks. Indigo Disc has a way larger map to explore, and the story overall is more exciting. But in my opinion, the $30 price tag is worth and I highly recommend it. Much like the cons, there are additional pros like overall quality of life improvements like shiny hunting and auto battling, but to be honest, this isn't meant to be a 30-minute video. At the end of the day, however, our thoughts and feelings on Scarlet and Violet, much like every other game in the series, and every other game in general, are just opinion based. With over 300 hours in Generation 9, it's safe to say that I like the games a lot, and I think that they're better than some other games in the franchise. It doesn't take away or downplay that this game deserved much better, it doesn't excuse the poor performance at launch, or lack of major fixes later in its life. From what has been shown of Legends ZA, hopefully the Pokemon Company has learned its lesson. Because it already looks better than Generation 9, but to be honest, that's not that hard. I think I can speak for most everybody when I'd say I'd rather wait for the games to cook a little longer if they meant overall better experience when playing. I will say that I think Scarlet and Violet gets too much overhate. While these games deserve heavy constructive criticism, I'm sure we've all seen people online trash talking them and beyond when they came out and still to this day. Scarlet and Violet still gets updates and constant mystery gifts, which I think says a lot. Again, we'd rather have massive performance updates and bug fixes, but the amount of content that's added to the game is pretty big and understated in my opinion. While we all have mixed opinions about Generation 9, it's okay to like these games, and it's certainly okay to love them. Let me know what you think about these games below, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.